Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Jeff Scott once again. Welcome to the second installment of the Basic Regenerative Science playlist on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. There's going to be a ton of great information getting posted here that I think can be beneficial to really anybody who watches or anybody who has an interest in science, cell biology, biochemistry, regenerative medicine, what have you. So thank you for joining me today. So today I could have done a million different topics. This is our second installment, as I mentioned. But one that I'm particularly interested in, and I think has critical importance, is understanding how cells communicate. Okay? Because when you're talking about biomedical therapies, biomedicine therapies, regenerative medicine therapies, in the end, what are we trying to do? We're trying to convince a cell to do something different than what it's doing, okay? So how those cells naturally communicate, if we can interject our therapies into those communication paradigms, then we're going to have a better likelihood of exerting the phenotypic effect that we're seeking. So I'm just going to lay out, again, this is going to be a relatively short video, but I'm just going to lay out the 4 different modalities of how cells communicate, okay? The first I want to start with is called autocrine, okay? So auto, you see that word, it means self. You know, we saw that in the last video with autologous, right? Auto, self, from self. So what autocrine signaling is, these are bioactive agents that are synthesized inside a cell and they're released through some exocytotic pathway, but they act directly back on that same cell to change its phenotype or to affect its phenotype, okay? That is autocrine. That's a cell acting upon itself, okay? Now, when I say phenotype, I'm going to say this all the time, and I'm not going to take for granted that everybody knows what phenotype is. You have phenotype and genotypes, right? Phenotype, if you have blue eyes, that's your phenotype. That's what's physically expressed. That's how I always remember it. pH, phenotype, pH, physically expressed. Your genotype could be very different. Your genotype, you'll have multiple alleles that may code for different eye colors, and I think eye color is a recessive gene. You'd have to go back and look at my genetics textbooks for that, but nevertheless, that's a phenotype. It's what you express. It's the observable behavior, okay? So in an autocrine fashion, the cell creates the bioactive agent, releases it, and then that agent acts back on that cell to change its behavior. That is autocrine. The next one I want to talk about is something you don't hear too much about. It's called intracrin. Intracrin, okay? Intra, within, okay? Intracrin is basically the cell creates a bioactive agent, okay? And that bioactive agent is in the cytosol of the cell itself. Now, the cell has intracellular receptors. So cellular receptors inside the cell that these agents can bind to and exert a phenotypic change, again, a change in behavior. This is common with steroid molecules. Steroid molecules are big in this intracrin pathway, but they're also big in other pathways as well because they act from a localized location across the body in many, many respects. So that's intracrin. Now again, you won't hear much about that. That's not a very commonly discussed pathway. The third one I want to introduce you to, and I think for what I do, and I think for what most of biomedicine is and what regenerative medicine is, one of the most important pathways is called paracrine. Paracrine pathways mean that cells release bioactive agents that act on nearby cells. Okay, so they're not acting necessarily back on themselves, but they're acting to change behavior of adjacent or not too distant cells and tissues. Okay, so you'll hear a lot about, especially when you're talking about placental and umbilical cord type formulations, you'll hear a lot of talk about paracrine effects. They'll be called paracrine effectors. Okay, so again, paracrine affects adjacent and nearby cells, not necessarily the cell that released the bioactive agent. Okay, and finally is the one that probably everybody's heard of if you have had your biology 101 class, and that is endocrine. Endocrine means cells releasing bioactive agents that act at a great distance. So you can think of these, your pituitary hormones, for example, that are synthesized and released from the pituitary cells deep in your brain, right? And they have effects throughout the body. They're affecting the observable behavior of so many different cell types. You can think of most hormones as endocrine effectors. From your adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, right? You're releasing epinephrines that have, various prostaglandins and such that have effect throughout the body. So those are examples of what endocrine function is. So again, endocrine, acting at a great distance. So with all four of these modalities together, this is how cells and tissues are really communicating with each other. And when we're talking about biomedicine or regenerative medicine, it's important to understand these innate cell signaling pathways so that you can develop therapies that allow, using the existing platforms for how these cells communicate to change phenotypes in the behavior of those cells. So thank you for listening to me in the second installment of Basic Regenerative Science. I certainly appreciate your time. Stay regenerative, my friends, and we'll talk soon.